My name is Judy Reed, and I'm with the Center for Women's Leadership. And I'm sorry to say that Jan Schubert, our director, is not able to be with us tonight. She is conducting a program for women in Saudi Arabia. So we've been getting some interesting emails from her on a daily basis telling us what life is like in Saudi Arabia working with these fabulous women. So it just confirms our beliefs that there are fabulous women everywhere in the world. And speaking of fabulous women, we have two sitting right before us tonight. I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce Myra Hart to you. Myra is involved with Babson College as a trustee, but also she's a faculty member at Harvard Business School. Myra's work and research centers around women entrepreneurs, and she is very active with 4 other entrepreneurs with a project called the Diana Project. They've written many books and papers and continue their work. And I believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Myra, but a couple of the professors are also here at Babson at the Blank Center. And their work is very extensive throughout the world with women who are starting companies and trying to receive funding for the companies. So, without further ado, Myra is going to introduce Lillian because she knows her very well. And enjoy yourself. If we'll do questions at the end, they'll do the conversation to begin, and enjoy.
Thank you so much, Judy. It really is a pleasure to be here today and to take this evening to share my wonderful friend, Lillian, with you. If you have not yet got the book or read it, you have a great treat ahead of you. As I talk to Lillian tonight, I'm going to assume that you haven't read it yet. And so I'm going to kind of tease out a little bit of what's in it, and hopefully that's going to really get you excited about the possibility of walking out with the book tonight and learning a lot more about this wonderful woman. Several years ago, in I think 2003,
yes,
I had the rare privilege of getting a call from the dean at the business school and asking me if I would be willing to be the presenter to Lillian when she received the Distinguished Alumni Award. And I was thrilled to do it. I knew her a little bit from some of our shared interests in women entrepreneurs through the National Foundation of Women Business Centers, which is now the Center for Women's Business Research. And our paths had crossed several times. So for me, it was really a thrill. And I said to Lillian that evening, you know, this is as simple as ABC. You're just a woman of extraordinary achievement and accomplishment. So obviously, you hit it on A. And B, you exhibit all the behaviors that I admire so much. Great leadership, great entrepreneurship. And by the way, you do it with real class, charisma. You're really able to energize people, so you've got it on all of this. But one of the C's that you probably didn't have throughout your life, Lillian, is a whole lot of comfort. In reading this book, there were a lot of times when people pushed you or pulled you sort of through the rabbit hole maybe you didn't want to go. So I'd love to hear, and I know everyone would, about some of the really important people who either pushed you to do things that you even didn't think you could do or didn't even imagine you could do, and some people who pulled you along.
Thank you, Myra. It's good to be here, and thank you all for coming to share this evening with us. There are a number of people who pushed, some pushed and pulled, and sometimes I was very resistant. Probably the first person who tried to really push me was my mother. She always wanted me to go to college, and she told me I could do whatever I wanted to do. I was the youngest of 5 children, and I think she put all of her dreams into me. I'm going to do the things that she wanted done. But when I finished high school, I'm 18 years old, I know exactly what's good for me, and I'm not listening to my mom because I'm not going to college. So she really pushed, and what I found out later is that she had a conspirator with her. I had a cousin who was about 6 years my senior, and he had gone to college, didn't have much more financial worth than I did, but he managed to go. And she found out she wasn't getting far with me, so she started talking to him to try to push me into college. And the two of them together, it finally worked. So those two people initially. And then the other person who had a great impact on my life and really pushed me and nudged me was a professor at Howard, Professor H. Naylor Fitzhugh, who was one of the first African-American men to receive an MBA at Harvard in 1933. So he knew what the experience was like, and he convinced me that I was Harvard material. But as I said later, he didn't really tell me the whole story. He sent me here. I didn't know women had not been accepted into the school until 1963. I came in 1967. And I did not know that no other black woman had preceded me. I'm thinking he probably knew that. But maybe he thought if he told me I wouldn't come, he was probably right. I probably wouldn't have come. So those are three of the people who really had great influence in pushing me along the way. And there were others that had an influence on me as I went through this process, and I call them my guardian angels.
You know, Lillian, I neglected to say where you were born and raised, and you mentioned that your mother was a really important figure in your life, throughout your life.
Yes.
But tell us a little bit about where you grew up and kind of what your early schooling was.
Okay. I grew up in a small town called Ballsville, Virginia. It's about 50 miles west of Richmond. This little town was so small, about 200 people. We knew everybody in the town. It was during the early 40s, during the days of segregation. I went to a segregated school. My mom was a college graduate, which was somewhat of a rarity during that time. She graduated from what is now Virginia State University in 1922. So she was a school teacher for a while, but gave up her teaching career to raise her children. So I grew up on this farm. My father was a subsistence farmer, which meant we grew everything we ate. And he was not an educated man. He did not think education was extremely important. He thought hard work was the way to success. My mother felt education. So there was a conflict there. But she pushed in her own way to make sure that we got educated. So this was a very small town I grew up in. We had none of the luxuries of life. We didn't have electricity until I was 8 years old. Never got indoor plumbing. Finally got a party line telephone when I was a preteen, and some of you may not know what a party line telephone is. It's one of those you share with other families, maybe two or more families. And we thought it was fun as children. We would pick up the phone, whether it was our ring or not, and we listened to everybody's conversation. As long as our parents didn't know about it. But I grew up in that type of environment. But I never saw myself as being a captive of that environment. I always had dreams of something more in life, and I just thought, but my dream at that time was fairly simple. I just wanted to get off the farm, and I was going to go to the big city and get a good job, make a lot of money, meet Prince Charming, live happily ever after, and that was it. So I headed to New York City. So leaving this little town of 200 people and going to New York City, where there were probably 200 people in one building, was really a culture shock for me. I had only been as far as Richmond, Virginia, before moving to New York at the age of 18. So that's where my younger years progressed.
Well, Lillian, I know that you have made tremendous accomplishments in your really formal education, but from what I can tell, experience was also a great teacher for you.
Yes.
And perhaps you could tell us a little bit about those early years of working in New York and the experience that directed you from there.
I say I went to college at the age of 22, but my first degree was from the School of Hard Knocks. And living in New York City, I thought going to New York with my high school diploma and good typing skills, I could get a really great job as a secretary or typist in some office. Well, that was a real surprise. The only job I could get when I got to New York was to work as a maid. And I worked for a family, I think it was on Fifth Avenue. Not what I had in mind. I could have stayed in Virginia and I could have done the same thing there. But as is usually typical of me, I try to extract something of value from any experience I have, particularly if it's not a very pleasant one. So in this experience, I said, now what can I gather from this? And what this experience showed me is how people live who had money. I had not seen that before. So I said, I like what I see, but I have no way of knowing how I'm going to accomplish that. I knew it wouldn't happen as a maid. So then I decided, my cousin worked at Macy's, and she suggested I apply for a job at Macy's. I did. Went there, and they asked me if I had any experience. I said no. They said, we only have people with experience. So I went back during the Christmas season and tried to get a job, thinking experience was not important then because they needed people for the Christmas season. Well, I was wrong. They still asked about experience. Well, by this time, I'm saying, you know, this is ridiculous. I am going to get a job here. So I came up with my scheme. I created my experience. I went back the third time, and when they gave me the application, I put down a list of companies in Richmond, Virginia that didn't even exist. But I thought I had nothing to lose. I knew if I told them I didn't have the experience, they wouldn't even interview me. And if they checked my references, they wouldn't hire me, or either hire me or fire me. Well, she gave me the typing test, and I passed with flying colors once I told them I had this experience. And she then said to me, you did so well on this test, I don't know if we can afford to hire you. And I'm thinking to myself, if you know what I know, you wouldn't hire me. But I got the job, and I stayed there for about a year. But I couldn't live on the salary. So I finally took a job as what I thought was a traveling job. It ended up being selling magazine subscriptions door to door. And I'm sure some of you may have had young people coming to your door selling magazine subscriptions, claiming they're going to get points towards a college scholarship. It doesn't happen. I did that for 2 months and finally decided I need to go back home, regroup, and I really need to go to college. So those jobs and those experiences in New York really showed me that education is what I need. There are no real shortcuts to it. I tried all the shortcuts and they didn't work. So finally, I've got to do it the right way.
So in a way, you are an entrepreneur already, because entrepreneurs, they put a lot of lines in the water, they test a lot of things, but they also know when to say enough, time to try something else.
Right.
And so you had that early. Now, when you did come back home and then eventually went on to Washington, D.C., you did it with a little help from some friends, and maybe some people who even weren't quite your friends yet.
Right.
Why don't you tell the role of these angels in your life?
Another angel was my aunt and a lady in Washington, D.C. who took me in. When I went back home, I wasn't sure what I was going to do, and my two brothers lived in New Jersey. They were home for the holidays. This was around Christmas. So they suggested I go back to New Jersey with them. My mother wasn't really excited about that. My brother was single, and she probably thought I would get caught up in this whatever the single men doing in New Jersey at that time. But she thought that was probably my best option. But on the way there to New York, we stopped by my aunt's house. Well, I used to love to stay, visit her when I was in school. And she asked me where was I going, and I said to New Jersey. And she said, why are you going to New Jersey? And I said, well, I don't know, have any other place to go. She said, why not New York? And why not Washington, D.C.? Well, I didn't know anybody in Washington. Well, she got on the phone, called a friend of hers in Washington, and asked her if I could come stay with her. I'd never met this woman. She was a friend of my aunt's, and she had grown up in the same town as my aunt did. And this lady agreed to take me in. My brothers dropped me off at her house, so I ended up going to Washington, D.C. instead of New Jersey. And that, I think, was a major turning point in my life. She was like a family person. She treated me like family. Didn't charge me rent until I got a job. But I think had I gone to New Jersey, I probably would not have gone to college. I probably would have gone there, I would have gotten a job working, doing something, and spent the rest of my life working in whatever job I could find there. But going to Washington as the diversion, I call it, that my aunt put in place, really made a difference in what happened to me in those next few years.
So, Lillian, you mentioned Howard University, where you graduated, but you didn't start at Howard, did
No.
you? Tell us the story of the evolution of your college career.
I got a job in Washington working in the government, in a typing pool. Now, that was another bad job. It was a big room with all of these people sitting there using dictaphone. I don't know how many people even know what a dictaphone is. But there were about 30 or 40 women, and there were 2 men in there. We were typing medical reports that doctors dictated for appeals of physical exams by veterans who had come back from the war. And I decided one day I couldn't do this forever. I had to find a way to go to school. So I started school at DC Teachers College, which is now the University of the District of Columbia. I took 6 hours the first semester, and I took 9 hours the second semester. So at the end of the year, I had 15 hours of credit. And that's the way I had planned to get my degree. But then it dawned on me that I'm 21, 22 by that time, and by the time I finished, I'd probably be really old. So I said I had to find another way to get into school on a full-time basis. I couldn't do this part-time. And that's when I remembered my cousin that had been conspiring with my mother to get me into college. Every time I saw him, he'd nag me about going to college. I hate to see him coming. Here he comes again talking about college. Finally, I decided, swallow my pride, talked to Rudolph, his name was Rudolph, and asked him if he could help me find a way to get scholarship or loans or whatever to go to Howard. He was happy to do it. I got a student defense loan, which was very prevalent at that time. I think they had like 3% interest. And I got a scholarship to Howard University. And I also worked 20 hours a week during the 4 years that I was there. So a combination of those have financed my education. And I was able to transfer 12 hours of those hours from DC Teachers College. So I had a head start. But at this time, I'm 22 years old. So I was very serious about my education. I didn't go to college at that point to have fun. I tried to have a little fun, but I didn't have time for much fun because I was working and studying very hard.
So one of those jobs was actually to be a research associate for Professor Fitzhugh, wasn't
Yes, yes. I met
Tell us a
Professor
little about
Fitzhugh my second year at Howard. He taught a course called Introduction to Business. I didn't know what I was going to major in when I went there. I hadn't decided. And I took this course, and I really enjoyed the course. It was my exposure to the world of business. And I also was intrigued by his teaching method. He taught using the case method, which was used at Harvard on a much smaller scale. But I found it intriguing that I had a chance to really express myself and analyze cases as opposed to just reading stuff and rehashing it to the teacher. And I took this course on Introduction to Business. Then I talked to him about what I might major in. And he encouraged me to major in business, and I majored in marketing, which was his field of specialization. I took most of my courses from him. He hired me as his student assistant during that second year, which gave me a chance to get to know him even better. And then he knew I was a struggling student. He gave me a job typing his dissertation. So I got to know him quite well. And during that process, sometimes people see things that you may not even see in yourself. During this process of my working with him, he obviously saw something in me that he thought would hold me well in going to Harvard. Why not encourage me to go to Harvard? Well, by the time I finished Howard, I was going to be 26, I believe. I'm thinking, I'm going to just go get a job. All these years, I still haven't made any money. So I want to go get a job. I wasn't planning to go to graduate school. But one day, I went to work, and he asked me, this was my junior year, he asked me, was I going to graduate school? And I hadn't really thought about it, but I thought since he was asking that, maybe I should think about it. And I said, I'm thinking about it. Well, I knew he was going to ask me again, so I started thinking, maybe I'd better do some research on graduate school. So I did. I looked at the University of Chicago, University of Michigan, and Stanford, I believe. A few weeks later, the question came up again. So where are you going to graduate school? So I told him, and then he says, why not Harvard? And I just looked at him like he must be crazy. I am not going to Harvard, and I'm sure I couldn't get in even if I wanted to go, but that's not a place that I even thought of going. Well, he continued to talk to me about it, and then he got another professor there, Dr. Wilford White, who ran the Small Business Development Center. He had got his doctorate at Harvard. So the two of them started working on me about going to Harvard. And I finally decided I'd apply so they'd just leave me alone. And I didn't get in the first year because I didn't take it really serious, I don't think. And I took the GMAT, and they told me my math scores weren't quite high enough. Well, that's all I needed to hear, that they weren't going to take me, because I knew then that I was Harvard material because Professor Fitzhugh had told me. I just decided I took this as a challenge. I retook the test and applied the next year, and I got in the year 1967.
And Lillian,
Still not knowing what I was facing.
if you knew then what you know now, would you have gone? You know, that's a great question, because at the time when Lillian was accepted, Harvard Business School had opened its doors to women. The first actually official class that had any women in it was the class of 1965, though they had had a partnership with Radcliffe for several years before that. They did not allow the women to live on the campus where the men did.
Right.
You actually had to live across the river at Radcliffe, a very healthy walk, especially on a cold winter day, where you were dressed up as if you're going to business.
That's right.
In these days, the men and the women dressed as if they were going to work in the business world. The men wore suits.
Suits and ties. The women wore
Sometimes the women wore
dresses, suits,
dresses.
not pants.
Pantsuits had not come in yet. No, it's no such thing. And you had to walk across the river to come to class. That alone probably would have deterred me.
I didn't know it when I got there. They told me I had to go to this dorm at Radcliffe on Ash Street, and when I arrived, I had the taxi to take me to my dorm. And I didn't really know until, I guess, the next day we had to walk to class. I didn't do a lot of research, obviously. I didn't visit the school to find out all of these details. But it was a long walk. It's about a half a mile, very cold. We had on high heels. We used to call them the IBM outfits.
Yeah.
The men wore the suits and ties. And we wore skirts and heels and stockings every day. So it wasn't a very pleasant environment. There were, in this first year class, my class, out of about 800 students, we started with 18 women. One dropped out at Thanksgiving. And just so happened the one that dropped out was in my section. But there were 3 women in my section, so that left two of us in the section with 98 men. All the teachers were men. So it wasn't like they were ready for us. They weren't really that welcoming, and in the method of teaching required class participation. Well, most of the women were intimidated to raise their hand. And I didn't know that many of the women in my class were going through many of the same feelings that I was having, particularly as far as class participation. Matter of fact, one of the ladies told me when I talked to her doing research for my book, she said she had just decided that she wasn't going to speak in class. She didn't care what her grade was, she just wanted to get out. Study groups was another thing. They encouraged you to participate in study groups, but most of the study groups met in the evening on the business school campus, which meant you had to go back to the dorm after class and walk back over to the business school at night to be in a study group. So most of the women were not in study groups. One woman in my dorm was in a study group. The men came over to Radcliffe to be in the study group with her. And the other one stayed over the campus late at night to study, and that was Robert Foote. She was the first Baker Scholar. But she told me later years that even after being a Baker Scholar and going out into the workforce and being at McKinsey for 9 years, she could still never make partner. She was very smart academically, she said, but she was very naive about the politics of corporate America. So you've got to know the academics, but you've got to know the politics too. Decide whether you want to play the game, but you at least need to know what the game is.
So Lillian, I mean, this story is a wonderful story, not only of your life, but of the incredible times in which you were growing up. And I think you have to kind of pull back a little bit the lens of kind of what was going on during the 60s.
Yes.
When you were making these decisions to move to Washington, go to college, and go to Harvard Business School. Kind of some of the much bigger events that were influencing your life.
Very tumultuous situation in the 60s. There was in the middle of the civil rights movement, the college sit-ins, the Vietnam War, lots of things were going on. When I was my first year at Harvard, my dad died in February, which was a traumatic kind of experience. And then in April, Martin Luther King was assassinated. And that was a very difficult time. Of course, I felt that hit me really hard, but I didn't have anybody that I felt comfortable turning to. I didn't know what the women in the dorm thought about civil rights, and I certainly didn't know what they thought about Martin Luther King, and I didn't feel comfortable broaching the subject at that time. So the next day when I went to class thinking we'd have a discussion about this issue, well, Martin Luther King in my section, Martin Luther King's name was not mentioned. They did close the school for his funeral, but we had no discussion about the civil rights movement, what he had done, the fact that he'd been assassinated, and that, of course, was another blow. But across the river at the main campus, there was quite a bit of activity going on. They were having memorial services, they were having sit-ins on campus, but the business school, physically located away from the rest of the university, and also, I think, mentally away from the rest of the university. They were a much more conservative institution than the main campus, and it was reflected a lot during those years in the early 60s, the mid-60s, late 60s.
Lillian, something that happened during your first year made you an activist. You had, all your classmates who were African American were men.
Right.
And a couple of them really thought that things should be changing, not just in the world, but in the microcosm in which you all were working together at Harvard Business School. So
Right.
what did you do to try to change the school?
Again, I mentioned 800 students in the first year class. There were the 18 women and there were 6 blacks, 5 guys and me. So two of the guys, one in particular, was really upset about this because he expected it to be different when he got to Harvard. And he and 2 of them had been talking and getting together and having meetings talking about this is not right. Why the most prestigious university in the world and the top school for training managers, why aren't blacks being trained for managerial positions? The world is changing and we need that too. So they made some attempts to talk to the admissions office and the administration about this, but they ran into a stone wall on most occasions. And then one evening, the 3 of us were sitting around, these 2 guys and I, we were sitting around talking, and we decided somebody needs to do something. We didn't know what needed to be done, but we thought we should be the ones to do it. So we decided to ask for a meeting with the dean. Dean George Baker was the dean then. We had no idea how we would be received, whether he'd even meet with us, and if he did meet with us, whether he'd agree to do anything, whether we'd be reprimanded. We just didn't know, but we were willing to take this risk. We asked for a meeting with the dean, and he agreed to meet with us. And in the meeting, he was very receptive. We asked him why there weren't more black students there, and he said, we don't know where to find them. Well, I think it was, well, you can find students everywhere, all over the world, we're not really hidden anyplace. So we said, okay, we'll help you find them. And we offered to go back to our alma maters and other universities to recruit qualified students. He agreed, and he, on the other hand, went out to corporations to get scholarships. So we went back to different colleges and universities and recruited students, and the next year they brought in 27 black students, which was a big increase over the first year. But we then also decided that those students shouldn't have to go through some of the things that we went through being there and not feeling comfortable. We established the African American Student Union to serve as a support system for those students coming in and to help guide them through the process. We wanted to make sure that they not only got into the university, we wanted to make sure they also graduated. So that organization had filled that role, and it's still a very active organization, one of the most active ones on campus. And they even do that now, but I understand they take them away to a weekend nice retreat.
Lillian, did you get any pushback from the other students at the business school? Thinking about the 60s, the tensions often ran very high. And a question of why would there be a separate student organization and why do you need this?
Well, there was some pushback from the other organizations when we tried to talk about how to get the dues transferred. Or student fees are part of the student association. How would this organization have funds to operate? And somehow that got worked out. And I'm not sure exactly how it got worked out, but we talked to one of the professors who apparently played a role in making sure that was resolved. So it did work out very successful. Now, as far as students on a personal basis, a one-on-one, it was sort of like, I was sort of like I was invisible. It was isolation. Students didn't really do anything overtly to make me feel welcome. But they didn't do anything to make me feel welcome, although they didn't do things to ostracize me. It's just like I wasn't there. And that's even sometimes a worse situation because you're not sure what they're feeling or thinking. You're not a part of anything. You're just out there. And even living in the dorm at Radcliffe, I'm not sure why we as a group of women didn't get together and form a study group or do something, but I think we were all just really intimidated, even when we weren't in class, because we didn't do any of that.
No, I would say, knowing the history of Harvard Business School pretty well, that even through the 70s, the numbers of women were very, very small until about 1975.
Okay.
And that if you talk to the women from any of that period, they felt very isolated. They really didn't have very much cohesion among themselves, and they certainly didn't feel integrated into the whole community very comfortably. So, though they did get to eventually live on the campus.
The dorms were co-ed the year after I left.
Yeah.
So I lived at Radcliffe for 2 years. The next year, the dorms were co-ed. Although they did it very slowly. It had something to do with the way they had to redesign around the heads.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Well, now that we've gotten you through undergraduate at Harvard Business School, my gosh, you're like 28, 29 when you're graduating.
Yes,
and
29.
You have a whole big life ahead of you. So pretty exciting things. One of the exciting things as you're graduating is going through interviews and looking at those job opportunities. Was that a big time for you?
No.
No?
No one asked to interview me, and quite frankly, I didn't seek out any comers to interview. I wanted to leave Harvard so badly. I didn't even think about going to interviews either. And I was heading back to Washington, D.C. A company that I had done some work with in Boston had an office in Washington. They told me that I could work there, so I just took that. It was working with the Office of Economic Opportunity. Was a government agency then. It was an agency set up to deal with poverty programs. It obviously failed. We did consulting for a while with them, but they closed their office in a year. So I got another job as manager of a banking association, and that lasted about a year. Then I got a job teaching at Bowie State University, and I enjoyed that. Finally, I was asked to come on as a consultant for a small business who had a company in the building maintenance service. A young lady I'd worked with recommended me because her dad had this company. He was having all kinds of problems. So I went to work with him for the summer between my teaching year at Bowie State. And then he offered me a full-time job. So I'd gone from having no jobs to now I have two full-time jobs. I got a choice. Well, I worked 2 full-time jobs that year. I'd work at Bowie State teaching, and then I would go downtown to Washington, D.C. to run his office. I was executive vice president. And I was also pregnant that year. So, we women can do a lot of things if we have to. So that year, at the end of that year, I had to decide whether I was going to go into teaching on a full-time basis or go into small business, running a business. And I decided that I would go into the small business, which I enjoyed. That exposed me to the world of being an entrepreneur, and I thoroughly loved it. I got to use a lot of my skills that I had been trained for. I got to do some of everything and really learn some of the things to do and not to do as an entrepreneur. And I started my business about 3 years later. That experience, I believe, was instrumental in the success of my business because I learned so much on that job. As I mentioned, things to do and things not to do. Matter of fact, I was profitable in my first year, which is usually, they say, fairly unusual for a startup. And I think I was in business almost 9 years before I lost money. And I wasn't sure how to deal with it once that happened. But that was a great experience, and I enjoyed being an entrepreneur, and I kept my company for 25 years.
So tell a little bit more about Centennial One and the decision to start that company. And by the way, I think you might have been pregnant with your second child about the same time as you gave birth to the new business. Is that about?
No. It was after that. I was pregnant with the second child. Yeah, yes, it was. It was around that time.
I know better than you. I've been reading the book here.
I started Centennial One, which was a cleaning company. And people ask me, why did I start a cleaning company? Well, that's the company I had experience in. I knew the business, and as I tell people, it's better for me to own the mop than to push the mop. So I managed those resources that cleaned the business. It was a very lucrative business, too. But again, in 1976, when I started my company, there were not many women in business. It was fairly new process then. There was a lot of talk on Capitol Hill about getting programs to help women business owners, but I don't know, not much was being done about it. And in my industry, there were even fewer women. I didn't even know any women who owned companies in my industry. It was a big industry, but all the companies were owned by men. But most of the workers were women. So I thought this was a great opportunity. And I started my company on a part-time basis. And I decided one day that I should tell my boss that I started this company because I didn't want him to hear it from someone else. And we agreed that I would stay and train my replacement. But about a few days later, he called me in and told me his board decided that if I'm going to leave, I should probably leave at the end of the week. So I got fired. Best thing that could have happened to me. At first, it seemed to be a disaster, but of course, that was a blessing in disguise for me because it gave me time to devote full time to setting up and getting my business started. I'm not sure it ever would have gotten off the ground with me trying to do it on a part-time basis. So I also had decided to do government work. And this was in May, end of May. The government's fiscal year was September the 30th. So I had 4 months to get a government contract. Otherwise, the way the cycle worked, I would have to wait probably another year before those contracts became available again. So I had to make it happen then, or otherwise it probably would not have happened. And I ran into some difficulty there too. I signed up for the government program, the Small Business Administration program, which was in the 8A program, and I thought I was a prime candidate for that. It was set up to help what they call minority-owned businesses to get government contracts. Well, I saw myself as a double minority. I'm black and I'm a female. Well, they turned me down. So I had to fight to get into the program, even threatening to go to my congressman to get accepted into the program. Finally got into the program and got my first government contract about a month before the end of their fiscal year, just in time to get in under the deadline. So that's how Centennial One got started.
So, Lillian, in fact, you were so successful that you actually kind of moved out of that program. It's not.
Yes. I moved out of that program after 9 years, and it's the only graduation that most people don't want to experience, graduating from the program. But it's designed to get you into the program and then move out into corporate America to do corporate contracts. And that worked successfully for me, except at the time that I was graduating from the program, SBA the rules were not well defined, and no one really knew how long they had in the program. And they sent me a letter after I'd asked a year earlier. It took them a year to answer my letter. They sent me a letter saying I was being graduated immediately. At that time, I was doing probably $7.5 million in sales, $5 million of which were under this program. So I was about to lose 2/3 of my business in a very short period of time. To add insult to injury, about a month or so before that, my husband and I had decided we were getting a divorce. So I'm coupled with facing a divorce and divorce from my company too, basically, all at the same time. So I had those things to deal with. But fortunately, I had planned ahead. But I didn't expect to have to implement this plan quite so soon. I had hired a marketing person to work on opening up doors in the commercial market so that I would be prepared when this graduation day came. And luckily, some of those came to fruition before I ended up getting off of the program. So instead of losing $5 million in sales that year, I lost about $1 million in sales. And that's when I showed my first unprofitable year after coming out of that program initially. So,
now, Lillian, you actually brought several people along and trained them. You had many mentors, but you also were a mentor. And you've had some very good and some not so good experiences with
right.
your follow. Just want to just comment on.
Right. I try to develop our employees from within, give them an opportunity to grow in the company with training programs, etc. And I think I was quite successful with that. A number of my employees moved to management level and stayed with me for a number of years. In hindsight, one of the bigger mistakes that I made is I think I gave too much power to some of my employees, who they began to see themselves as the face of the company instead of me being the face of the company. And that caused some problems internally. And when I got ready to sell the company, it caused some major problems. So one of the things I learned is you have to stay in touch with your customers. You have to be the leader and the face of your company, even as you delegate. In some aspects, I abdicate some of my responsibilities as the face of the company. And that's very unhealthy. And some of the other people that I brought along remained fairly loyal to the company and ended up going to, one young man started his own company, and others went to management positions in similar organizations, some in related organizations. But the one thing I learned from that, and then another thing that I didn't do well is I did not fully utilize my network, say from Harvard and school. I could have used some of the people that I'd gone to school with as resources for helping to build a company and a sounding board, because it was very lonely as an entrepreneur, a female entrepreneur particularly, because there weren't many out there. There was really no one I could talk to at times and to share what I was going through. That gradually changed in later years, but I was, for a number of years before I had that available to me. So I'm telling you all, wherever you go to school, use the network that you have, because it can be a good resource to you in helping further your career and making contacts for you. And you can use, they can also be, you can give back to them in ways too. Now, I mentor certain other individuals. I still have individuals that I mentor. One in particular is a young lady who is in the same industry that I was in, and she has a very successful company now. And I used to subcontract some parts of my contract to other small businesses to give them a chance to develop and grow, because there's a lot of work out there, and I didn't really see them as necessarily competing with me, because we weren't in the same arena at that time. So I wanted them to grow. And if I were going to compete with them, I'd rather train them to be good competitors instead of being bad competitors. So I saw that as a positive for me and for them.
So Lillian, I have a lot more questions, but I also want to share this time with members of our audience. I'm going to just save one for the end, and I'm opening it up to all of you to throw it open for questions from the audience. Yes.
Hello, it's a pleasure to meet you. My name is Michael Dempsey, and as myself, I am a young aspiring entrepreneur. And when you're going through the stages of entrepreneurship, you know that there are a lot of difficult things that stand in the way, and a lot of times you get the feeling that you're being deterred or that you're just not doing things right. Is there any advice or opinions that you would give to someone who's in my level, who's basically just trying to make their way for themselves, trying to find a path to reach their utmost potential? What is your number one advice for like someone like me?
Well, you've got to be confident. Whatever it is you want to go into, know as much as you can about the business you want to go into. If you have a chance to have experience in the industry that you want to go in, that's my first bit of advice. If not, do extensive research. And you have to be committed to your goal and idea, because you'll find plenty of people who will tell you can't do it. They'll find all kinds of reasons that you either can't do it or shouldn't be doing it. And so first, you have to be solid in your commitment to your goal of being an entrepreneur. And seek advice as much as you can. Many people are willing to give you advice and guidance, and asking for help is not a sign of weakness. It's okay to admit you don't know something, but find those people that you trust and you feel comfortable working with. Find a mentor. People are willing to be mentors, but they want to be asked. They don't mind sharing their knowledge, and they're frequently honored to do so. But so find somebody you respect and trust to be a mentor.
And just to throw in, it's very hard to believe that you're actually the first African-American female to graduating from Harvard because you're still very young and you're still very beautiful.
Oh, thank you. Oh, I love it. You got my vote. Yes.
Yes,
He'll be calling you later.
yes, yes.
Lillian, how do you think your experiences shape what your daughters decided to do?
I have impressed upon my daughters to be what they want to be. I did not want to put them in a pigeonhole. Now, my youngest daughter, initially, I had hoped to be in the business, and I think initially she was interested. But because of some of the turmoil that was going on and some of the things that I think I didn't do correctly, she did come in but decided that she didn't really like that and didn't like the business. My oldest daughter made it very clear from the beginning that she's a fine arts type and she likes dancing and film and these types of things, and she didn't want any part of this business. What she didn't realize, I think, at that time is that she does have the mind for a business. It just wasn't that business. And she has since started a dance company, and she's working in the music industry. My other daughter is in management in a company and still says she may one day want to do a business, and I'm encouraging her to do that. So I've tried to instill in them to make their own path in the direction they want to go, and I'm always very supportive of it. I don't always agree with what they do, but my mom didn't agree with me either. So.
Yes.
You said the first business was Centennial 1.
Yes.
Does that imply there was a Centennial 2?
No, no.
And what happened after the first losing year then, the first year you lost money?
The first what?
You said that after 9 years was the first year that you actually lost money.
Oh, I had to sort of regroup the company. I had to get the company on a profit mode, and I did all kinds of tactics to get the company profitable again. I cut costs, I scaled back on things, I did more aggressive marketing, and the company then grew. It got back on a growth path and eventually grew to about 20 million. So it was just something I had not experienced, having to deal with turning around a company that was losing money. That was another education.
And Lillian, you sold the company about maybe
2001.
2001. Yes, Mary.
My questions have to do with your particular section that you went through at school, and I'm curious if you could talk about this. You mentioned it sounded like there was not a lot of interaction, but you sit in a certain seat,
Yeah.
and generally that first year, did you stay in the same seat every
Yes.
day? So were the people around you, like, were they friendly with you? That's part one.
Okay.
Part one. And so sort of that, trying to get a sense of how isolated you were or were not. And then did you feel any kind of discrimination, racial discrimination? And then over the years, as you've gone, if you've gone to reunions, have you seen your relationship change in the class as you felt more confident and all of that?
I was in section D, and I was sitting, I think, like 2-3 rows back between two very nice young men. They were very friendly, and I think they had some appreciation for what I may have been going through. They were very supportive. I did not notice any overt racism. As I mentioned, it was more like I wasn't there, or like being invisible. And I did not, when I left Harvard, I wasn't even going to graduation, except my mom would have been very disappointed. So I did it for her. I went to graduation for her. I think the other two guys I mentioned started, I don't think they even went to graduation. I just wanted to leave. I didn't go back for a reunion until, it may have been my 25th. And I didn't really enjoy it that time. I said, I'm not going back anymore. But I did go back for my 30th, and I had a really nice time. Everybody had mellowed a bit. And I went back last fall for my 40th and had a great time. So the older they get, the better it goes.
Yes.
I just going to say that you pretty much mentioned yourself almost as serving as a double minority, being African American and being a woman. So my question would just be, in terms of more of the personal aspects of your life that you faced, how did you prioritize dealing with your business while also dealing with personal issues involving your family?
That's a good question, and one that men and women still deal with today, and people talk to me about it. When I started my business, my kids were young, I think 2 and 4, or something like that. But fortunately, my mother came to live with me when my first child was born, which was really great. She took care of my oldest daughter. But when I had my second child, which was a year and a half later, she wasn't able to take care of 2 infants. So my husband and I decided that we would make whatever sacrifices we had to make to bring in live-in help. I was able to do that, where my mother supervised that person. So that's how I handled it. And that made it possible for me to be able to spend more time with the children when I came home, because I didn't have to be bothered with doing the housework and cooking and ironing, which I didn't like to do anyway. But I didn't have to do that. And then when I started my business, I turned my garage into my office. I worked from home because my customers didn't have to come to me, I went to them. That gave me the flexibility of being able to spend time with the children, take them to nursery school, participate in their school activities, daycare. And then as I got older and I moved out from my house, I got an office that was very close to my home. And they would take them to the office sometime with me. And when I traveled, I would take them on trips with me. So they said they did not feel deprived.
So Lillian, actually you've named 2 of the secret ingredients for working women. One, be as close as possible to your family and use their extension, really a lot.
Yes.
And the other is minimize your commute time, because all that time is just, I won't say totally wasted, but you can spend it elsewhere. Yes, in the back.
I wondered, you're talking about going into a field that was mostly women were doing the work, but men were running the businesses.
Yes.
Did you have a philosophy you try to bring into that space as a woman, having women working for you, about how they be treated?
I did. I think I brought a different aspect into management even as I dealt with the men. And I brought in a different idea of what the employees, how they should be treated in general. I had a cleaning company, and as most of you know, many of you may be guilty of this too, the cleaning person is the last person you think of even maybe saying good morning to. You don't think about that until they don't maybe not empty your trash can or something. So I tried to instill in them a sense of pride in what they did, and I talked to my customers about that also, and it did work a lot. We even called them our employees maintenance specialists. They did special work, they weren't janitors. And they had a sense of pride in feeling that way. And I gave women management positions as well as the men, so promoting them whenever I could. And a lot of that filtered over into the association. I was very active in the association, which was an international association. It became its first female president in 1995. So I was well respected in the industry, and some of the things that I implemented in my company, or beliefs that are values, I tried to impress that upon the men also. Some instances it worked and some it didn't.
Yes.
As an entrepreneur, we learn a lot about ourselves. Is there anything you learned about yourself that you found surprising? That you went, oh my gosh, I didn't know this about myself as you went through those years building a business and growing a business?
That's a good question. I guess maybe one is that I found an instance I had more patience than I'm usually not a very patient person. I want things done. Why I can't understand why you can't do this. It's so simple. Well, I learned not to be so judgmental of that with other people. If I understood how to do something, it didn't mean they clearly understood it the same way that I did. So I did learn that about myself.
Yes.
How do you deal with the financial component in terms of the lack of capital that's usually an issue for entrepreneurs? Can you tell me a little bit about your experience?
It's a big issue. I was very fortunate and extremely lucky when I started my company. I had had a personal relationship with a banker. My husband and I had borrowed money for personal needs over the years and always paid it back. And at the time that I started my business, my particular banker was getting ready to leave the bank where he was working, and he was moving to take over the presidency of a new bank. So I took him to lunch one day and told him about my great idea of starting my company and how he could be a part of this successful company if he loaned me some money. Well, I sold him on the idea, and he gave me a line of credit, which was all I needed. And I used that line even when I didn't need the money, just to show that I was responsible, would be paying back the money. And I stayed with that bank. I grew with it until I grew the ability to loan me the money that I needed. So that's how I got my money. But that's very, very unusual that a bank will loan money to a startup company. But in essence, they loan money to you. They're really lending the money to you, the person, that they are putting their trust in you, the individual, as opposed to your business, because they don't know much about your business. So you have to sell them on the idea that you are trustworthy and will repay the money, which is sometimes very difficult to convince and almost impossible in today's environment, probably.
Yes. Yes?
Hi, I'm Kalika Rogers. I'm also a freshman of Babson College. And prior to coming here, I watched an interview when you were on a Virginia morning news show, and you were asked the question why you weren't really active in the civil rights movement while you were at Harvard University. And you said something like, I want to quote you directly, actually. You said,
whoa, I don't remember what I said.
You said I had an obligation and responsibility to make sure that I completed that journey. So do you feel as if at this moment in your life you have attained the level of success to which you were referring?
Well, in some respect, but success for me is a journey. It's not a destination, not a point where I can just stop and say, oh, I've made it.
Okay.
And I think that's the danger, that you sit back on your laurels and say, okay, I'm here now. It's an ongoing thing. For me, it's a path that I'm continuing to travel on. You know, I'm still meeting challenges, and I'm evaluating what I'm doing and reevaluating. So success is still out there. It is a journey for me. Now, when I was so busy, I didn't have time to do a lot of the civil rights involvement then. I probably had blinders on. I had to go down this road, and there was only one way for me to get there.
Okay. I actually wanted you to say that out loud, because I think I kind of read that on Twitter, actually. I was on Twitter, and I follow you on Twitter now, and I saw that. Sorry. And I thought you referred to success as a continuous journey, and I just wanted you to try to say that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, that must have been one. I don't tweet much. You saw that on Twitter? Okay.
You know, because you and I grew up in the same era, and probably there are some of you in the audience who did as well, we experienced a life and a time that's completely different. And sometimes just showing up was really being an activist.
That's true.
And
because you were frequently the only one.
Be the one who would stay there and be the only one, whether it's the only woman, the only African American, or in your case, the only African American woman who even thought about trying this, was an activist movement.
That's true, and I found myself in that situation frequently during those years where I was the only one. Sometimes the only woman, and sometimes the only one or both. I call myself a twofer.
Yes.
Sometimes it works for me very well, and sometimes it works against me.
So, Lillian, I'm just going to wind this up so that you'll have an opportunity to meet informally with all the people. I think this is a wonderful, wonderful story, the journey of one woman. And it's a very courageous thing. You know, in one respect, I think we all would love to have the world hear our personal stories. But in another, there are many aspects of our personal life that perhaps we don't want to reveal, or the people who are around us don't necessarily want us to reveal. Whether it's your first husband, or one of your employees who really didn't turn out that well, or maybe your daughters don't really want to have so much about their lives, but you told the story. But it's not just your story. There's a reason that you told the story for everybody in this room. What do you hope that they'll take away from this book?
I hope they will take away that we all have our personal journeys, and we all have obstacles in our way. Mine may be different from yours, but behind most obstacles, there's an opportunity. And most opportunities have some degree of obstacles in there. So don't allow that to stand in your way of doing what it is you want to do. There are many different ways to get where you want to go. You've just got to be courageous, believe in yourself, and have the confidence that you're going to make it, and use people around you to help you make that journey. So it's a story of not giving up, setting your goals high, create your own path, and your path may become somebody's highway, who knows.
Thank you so much, Lillian.